Good afternoon and welcome. Well, good morning and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Alana Sivan. Earlier this year, the newly elected prosecutor of Michigan's Washtenaw County, Ellie Savit, announced that his office would stop seeking money bail in criminal court cases. And with this new policy, Savit made his county, which is the home to Ann Arbor, the first in Michigan to eliminate money bail. And Savit has explained his decision as a way to address the socioeconomic inequities present in the two-tiered system of justice in Michigan. And in place of money bail, Savit has said that his office will ask judges to hold people pre-trial based on their safety risk, not their ability to pay for their freedom. And he has pointed to all of the potentially catastrophic effects of pretrial detention. Things like the destabilization of somebody's life, and has also cited data from the ACLU showing that Black people in Washtenaw County were more than 8 times more likely than white people to be jailed because they cannot afford bail. And so joining me now to discuss this new policy and the state of bail reform across Michigan are Washtenaw County Prosecuting Attorney Ellie Savit and Chief Assistant Prosecuting Attorney Victoria Burton-Harris. Thank you both so much for being here today.
Thank you for having us.
So, Prosecuting Attorney, I'll start with you. Maybe you can start by explaining a bit more in depth exactly what this new policy is and how it's changed the system of pretrial justice in your county.
Sure. So I think it's always important to start with the basics. What is cash bail? Cash bail is a system in which you are arrested and you are charged with a crime, and you are told that you can go free from jail pending trial. Again, this is all before you've been convicted of anything, but you can only go free if you come up with a certain amount of money out of your bank account. Now, if you think about what that does, that means that somebody who is poor or working class, even somebody who is charged with a relatively minor crime, somebody who doesn't pose a safety risk to the community, they may sit in jail for days or weeks or months simply because they cannot afford to pay to get out. At the same time, a wealthy person, a person with means, even somebody who was accused of a really serious offense and does pose a danger to the community, they're going to be free simply because of the size of their bank account. This shouldn't be acceptable to anybody. We shouldn't have two systems of justice in this country. But that is what a cash bail system provides. It treats people differently, straightforwardly, because of the size of their bank account. So, we said, look, we are not going to be complicit in this anymore. We are no longer seeking cash bail, and we have not sought cash bail on a single case since I have been prosecutor. Now, this doesn't mean that we just say we're opening the jailhouse doors and we're letting everybody go. Our prosecuting attorneys make individualized assessments of whether the facts of a case demonstrate that somebody imposes a real safety risk to the community. And if they do, and there's no other way to ensure the safety of victims or the safety of the community, we seek conditions, including conditions that may require them to be held in jail. But the same standards apply to everybody. Whether you are held now or whether we are seeking to hold you now is not dependent on how much money you have. It is dependent on the actual risk that you pose to the community. That's something everybody should want. No matter where you fall on the spectrum, you shouldn't be comfortable with poor people sitting in jail for days and weeks and months because they don't have money. And you also shouldn't be comfortable with rich people being able to purchase their freedom even when they pose a serious risk to the community. So that is what we've done. We've simply taken money off the table entirely. And whether you are held pre-trial in Washtenaw County, as far as our office is concerned, does not anymore depend on the size of your bank account.
So a follow-up to that, how does the new system work? Because you said that you're determining whether or not somebody poses a safety risk. How do you determine if that's the case?
So we don't believe in, for example, algorithmic risk assessments, which there's been a lot of data that indicates that those are racially biased, because what they often do is they assign a number based on how many times you've had interaction with police officers. Well, we all know that police officers often engage in policing and over policing of minority communities. So we don't want to rely on a computer to make the decision for us. So we look with a human eye at every single case. And so, by way of example, if what the facts of the case are is somebody has an escalating cycle of domestic violence, the case that they've been brought in for involved them shooting a gun at their partner, they happen to be wealthy, right? We're going to say, look, we don't really think that you can be back out in the community, because everything that's in front of us demonstrates that you are going to go back and, frankly, try to finish the job. So we'll seek to hold somebody, or we'll seek stringent conditions on release if we do consent to release in that circumstance. By the same token, you may have somebody with a relatively lengthy criminal history, but it's basically interactions with police around marijuana-related crimes, which is legal now in Michigan, and we all know that the data shows that Black people, for example, are 4.7 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana in Washtenaw County. You can say, well, there's a lengthy criminal history, but if you look deeper into the case, it doesn't indicate that person poses a real serious risk to the community. So in that case, we'd say, okay, we depending on the case, we may be comfortable with just the person getting out on personal recognizance. If it's a little bit more serious, we may impose certain conditions on their release, but we're not just blindly relying on numbers or on algorithms to make this determination, because justice by a computer is not something that I think any of us should be comfortable with.
So Victoria, I want to get you in here. Talk to us about why eliminating money bail was such a high priority in your county, and talk to us also a little bit about what pretrial justice looked like in the county before you implemented this policy, and what made your office want to change it.
So for me, when I was running in a neighboring county to be a prosecutor, I started attending our governor had convened a joint task force on pretrial incarceration around this very issue of what are we going to do with cash bail in the state moving forward. Obviously, people are learning that it's problematic for all of the reasons that Ellie stated. And I started attending those meetings, and I learned a lot from the research that was presented by Pew Charitable Trust. I learned a lot from the personal testimonies that were shared from residents who had been impacted, not only as defendants, but as victims, as family members of both across the state. And what I learned was that, there was no correlation between, one's ability to pay cash bail and the likelihood that they would appear in court. There was no correlation between one's ability to pay cash bail and, the likelihood that they would not commit new offenses. In fact, when people in our state were released pre-trial without having to pay any money, 87% of them reappeared in court. 89% did not reoffend. So this idea that you need to require people to be, financially invested in a case in order to reappear in court and continue on through the process, or to not go out and commit new crimes, it's just simply not true. And we now know that. And I'm a firm believer that when you know better, you do better. So we now know better, and we now have to do better. We have an obligation. When I also first started to think about this issue, I connected it immediately to claims of innocence. We have a huge problem in our state and across the country where people are sitting in prison and serving sentences for crimes that they simply did not commit. Well, then you ask, how did they get there? Over 90% of cases in our criminal legal system are resolved by way of pleas, not trials. So that means that many people are pleading guilty to crimes that they did not commit. And the reason why they do that oftentimes go right back to pretrial and this issue of cash bail. If one is charged and even overcharged by a prosecutor for crimes that they did not commit, and they're being held pre-trial in a jail cell simply because they don't have the money in their pocket to afford their freedom, If you dangle a carrot in front of them and tell them that they can go home and plead guilty to X amount of offenses out of the 10 that they've been charged, if they plead guilty to 4 or 5 and they get to go home on probation, they're probably going to do that. But what happens if they come back again into the system and they now have, those convictions that they have already pleaded guilty to just so they can go home? Now they're looking at an enhanced sentence because of those prior convictions, and they're now looking to go right to prison. And they may not have committed the first set of offenses, may not have committed the second set of offenses that they're pleading guilty to. But that's the system that we have been operating in for so long. It's true here in Washtenaw County. It's true across the state of Michigan. And I firmly believe that when you are given the power to do good, you absolutely do that. We have been afforded a very unique opportunity, a precious opportunity, to sit as progressive prosecutors looking to do something different with our justice system based on what we know, based on the evidence and the research, based on our experiences. I come to this office as a former defense attorney, and I've seen this play out on the ground day in and day out. And I absolutely wanted to use my power in this office sitting next to Ellie Savit to do something different. And I am very pleased to report that on day one, we started to do that.
Victoria, as you were talking about sort of the long-term impacts of holding someone pre-trial, and one of those impacts is that they end up being more likely to take a plea, which will then create adverse effects later on if they're ever charged with another criminal court case. And it has me thinking about this article that we've talked about here on the Appeal Live, written by Megan Stevenson and Sandy Mason, where they weighed the cost benefits of holding people in jail cells pre-trial, and ultimately determined that the costs of pre-trial incarceration are so high, and there are so many deleterious effects, including destabilization of one's life, separation from family, the potential trauma of being incarcerated, all while somebody is not convicted of a crime. And then you're adding as well the important impact, the long-term impact of how that will affect criminal court cases in the future. So they determined that with all of these horrible things that happen when someone is incarcerated pre-trial and weighing them against the benefits of incarcerating someone pre-trial, they came to the conclusion that virtually no one should be incarcerated pre-trial, with a few exceptions. So I'm curious to hear both of your views on that analysis, in terms of, do you agree? Do you think that there should be a lot fewer people incarcerated pre-trial than there are now? And I will start with you, prosecuting attorney.
All right. So in general, and I read the article and I read it with interest, and I find a lot to agree with there. One thing that we've always done in the criminal legal system is pretended like the cascading adverse consequences that come out of it don't exist. And let's put a real human face on this. If you are held in jail pre-trial and you are poor or working class, right, which is exactly the type of person that typically is going to be unable to afford cash bail, the data shows that after even a day or two sitting in jail, you are likely to lose your job. If you lose your job, you are likely to lose your housing. If you lose your housing and you're a caretaker, what happens with your kids? Your kids may be homeless. Your kids may at best have to switch schools in the middle of the year because they're going to live with relatives, right? And what the educational data shows us is that in the best of circumstances, switching schools in the middle of the year unexpectedly for a kid results in about 6 months loss of academic growth. So we are really imposing serious trauma, serious harm, and intergenerational harm, indeed, in these cases simply because we're holding somebody in jail before they've been convicted of anything. So I agree. And our policy says, look, pretrial incarceration is the last resort. We would only seek it if there's absolutely no other way to ensure that we can keep the community safe. And what our policy says expressly is our assistant prosecuting attorneys are instructed to seek the least restrictive conditions that nevertheless ensure public safety. So we do need to be holding a lot fewer people because the costs are tremendous, including the costs on innocent third parties, including children, families, folks who aren't being accused of anything. And I'll just say this in terms of the public safety angle of things. We here in Washtenaw County, quite frankly, had a trial by fire around reducing our jail population because of the COVID pandemic. Once COVID hit, we moved as a county swiftly, and I give a lot of credit to our sheriff and our chief judge here who moved quickly to thin the jail population dramatically and got it down to record low population, with the idea being that, the only people sitting in jail during a pandemic should be those that really absolutely need to be there. We didn't see a resulting increase in crime in Washtenaw County. We were able to do this safely. And so it put lie to the idea that pretrial incarceration generally is something that keeps our community safe. And I firmly believe that it was the right thing to do during the pandemic. Nobody who doesn't pose a threat should be sitting in jail pre-trial during a pandemic where, social distancing in a jail is impossible. My view is nobody who doesn't pose a threat should be sitting in jail pre-trial at all. And that's what our policy provides.
Victoria, feel free to jump in here.
Yeah, I'm really glad that Ellie mentioned, shrinking the jail population during the pandemic, because that's something that I looked at the pandemic and said, out of all of the horrible things this pandemic has been and has done, the one good thing, or one of the few good things, is that this pandemic has shown our officials and our communities across the country that we do not need people to be held in jail while they are to be presumed innocent. They have not pled guilty. They have not been found guilty. We don't need to hold them in the county jail unnecessarily for our safety. That is just a fallacy. That is not true. And we've proven that that is just simply not true. And I really am hopeful that people understand that and keep that with them moving forward. And I also want to, as Ellie, talked about putting people and faces to this problem. I want to take that a little bit further and share a story of when I was a criminal defense attorney and represented folks, faced with having to pay cash bail to get out, or having to stay caged, again, while they're presumed innocent until their case is disposed of. There was a man, and this will stick with me forever. He was accused of committing crimes, and he told his wife, don't pay my bail. It's too high. They were living from check to check, barely financially stable. And he was convinced that he was going to be out soon, that, this was all going to work out. He was absolutely innocent. And it's just a matter of time before the court system and the prosecutor's office realizes that he's innocent, and then he's going to be able to go home. And so his wife said, okay. And he continued to sit in the jail. And the case continued to drag on and on and on. And he lost his job. And then his wife, unable to pay for childcare for their 3 children on her income alone, she was forced to quit her job so that she could stay home and care for their children. When my client finally returned home after sitting in the jail unnecessarily for an extremely long time, and his charges were eventually dismissed, he came back to a house that he left, which had 2 incomes coming in and 3 children that were thriving in childcare. He came back to a household with no income. No income for himself, no income for his wife, and they were forced to move, just like Ellie illustrated. His children were therefore forced to change schools, just like Ellie illustrated. So this is not something that happens in theory. It happens every single day. And this system decimates families. And when you add on this archaic cash bail system that a lot of counties still are hell-bent on furthering, it really just exacerbates the problem. And so, I apologize here. I want to continue to focus on the very real people and the lives that are impacted by cash bail, and really start to plead the case to folks with these stories of why we should not continue cash bail.
Absolutely. And we've seen how cash bail not only destabilizes lives, just like you've talked about, but in many cases has even taken lives. Here in New York, I think about Layleen Polanco and Khalif Browder, who both passed away as a result of being held in pretrial. And so, but I also think it's really important that you both have honed in on the lack of efficiency when it comes to preserving public safety. Because I think what we've seen in multiple jurisdictions is anytime there's some sort of decarceral reform, particularly bail reform, there's always some post article or one crime is taken. Maybe there's one bad incident that happens in the community, and then that's sort of blown up and it's all blamed on change, whether it's bail reform or something of that sort. So I'm curious to hear from both of you. Have you gotten that any sort of pushback? And I also want to just sort of specify that so often when this link is made, there's usually not actually a link between that and whatever the reform is, but that's what it's blamed on. So I'm curious to hear, have you encountered any of that pushback and how you fought back against it?
Well, what I'll say is this. I think that on bail, we have been fortunate not to have as much blowback as you've had in some other communities. Part of that, quite frankly, is because I ran basically a 2-year-long campaign, and this was a centerpiece of my campaign. So people knew it was coming. And we were fortunate to be able to have conversations with folks across the community about what bail is, why it is harmful, what eliminating cash bail means, and what it does not mean. And we were able to change minds about it. I'll tell you that, I was campaigning during a pandemic, obviously. So instead of going door to door, I'd sit at my dining room table all day and just make calls to voters. I'd call voters, including voters that were a little bit skeptical of our ideas around bail reform. And this was a centerpiece of my campaign. And they pick up the phone and be like, "Oh, you're that prosecutor candidate that just wants to let everybody out of jail." And I'd say, "No, let's talk about what cash bail is and what it isn't." And by the end of the conversation, people were on board because they understood that eliminating cash bail fundamentally means that you're just not continuing a system in which wealthy people are treated differently than poor people. Now, in terms of sort of blowback and people opposing our policy since we put it into place, we've gotten a little bit of it, but really not as much as you've seen in places like New York City or something like that, where as you say, every single crime that is committed in a city of 8.5 million people is all of a sudden the fault of bail reform. One thing that I've always found really curious about that line of attack, which, let's be clear, it is Willie Horton style fear mongering that impedes progress. But we always talk about the one or two instances in which, yes, somebody was released without cash bail and goes on and commits another crime. We never talk about the people that are released with cash bail and go out and commit another crime. We never talk about the failure of our criminal legal system to rehabilitate and get people back on the right track. If somebody's been in jail several times before, it's always, "Oh, this was a hardened criminal." Nobody ever turns around and says, "Well, why didn't the correction system correct the first 5 or 6 times that they were in jail?" So it is an intellectually dishonest fear-mongering argument against cash bail, particularly when you look at the statistics. I followed very closely what happened in New York, and if you actually look at the numbers, just 83 crimes in a city of 8.5 million people were committed by people who were on pretrial release during that period when the New York Post was blaring at every turn, here's somebody that committed a crime and it's bail reform's fault. So it's dishonest, but it's also more fundamentally dishonest because we never apply the same scrutiny to our criminal legal system writ large, and the failure to rehabilitate, and indeed the way in which it often makes things worse. There is data out there that demonstrates that if you are held pretrial on cash bail, 5 years down the line, you are actually more likely to commit a new crime than if you were released on your own recognizance. And the reason for that is, of course, because it perpetuates cycles of desperation. You are more likely to commit a crime of desperation if you lost your job and your entire life trajectory was altered back earlier, given your involvement in the criminal legal system. We don't talk about that on aggregate enough. We don't make the case, I think, or at least often the media doesn't dig in enough around how bail reform actually keeps us safer. But I think it's incumbent on all of us that are criminal justice reformers to have these conversations, to talk to people about what cash bail really is and what it isn't. Because the truth of the matter is, I found during my campaign, and we found in our community, that we can get people on our side because, look, at its core, this is just an inequitable system. And I don't think very many people would straightforwardly say, yeah, I think rich people should be able to buy their way out of the criminal legal system.
So quick follow-up to that. First of all, feel free to come to New York and do some education here.
I love New York.
It's a great place.
Yeah.
But more seriously, I do want to talk about sort of, because to be honest, the fact that your policy has not gotten wide pushback is pretty remarkable, because a lot of what we talk about on the show is sort of the pushback that different places get and sort of how prosecutors handle that. So have you been sort of using these public education methods in other jurisdictions, both within Michigan and also across the country, to sort of push this idea of reform?
Absolutely, and this is probably a good time to plug our PAC that Victoria and I just started, which is called the Pursuit of Justice PAC, and we just launched it this week. pursuitofjusticepac.com if you want to give, and we aim to use this to support criminal justice efforts more broadly in the state of Michigan. But what we have done is a couple of things. Number one, of course, I ran a campaign openly on it. I think it behooves reform prosecutors to say exactly what they're going to say, because that way when people attack you for doing it later, you can say, look, this is what the voters wanted. I ran very openly on this, and we had the community conversation, and I'm respecting the will of the voters. Number two, we actually formed working groups before we put into place any of our policies, which encompassed a broad variety of perspectives across the community, including folks that are victims advocates, prosecutors, law enforcement, community leaders, and we hashed out this policy together. So we wanted to get buy-in at the outset. But then the third thing is we've been totally transparent in releasing all of our policies, explaining why we're doing what we're doing, what it means and what it doesn't mean. And we've been using that indeed to advocate, because it's right there in black and white why we're doing this and what it means and what it doesn't mean. So when folks are interested in bail reform in a sort of larger sense in the state of Michigan, we can point to what we'd said, we can point to what we did, we can point to why we're doing it. And once people hear that, I think it brings them over to our side.
And Victoria, have you seen any momentum for bail reforms in any of these other neighboring counties that you've been talking with?
Other communities are paying attention. Other communities that have, a large organizing base of, community organizers and advocates. Some of these groups that, were behind my race and behind Ellie's race, they're looking to expand this model, and they're asking their elected officials, how can we have what they're doing in Washtenaw County here in our county? They are going out and saying, you know what, we're going to expand our efforts to get more reformist and progressive prosecutors in office throughout our state, because they can see that what we're doing is working. And I think that really that needed to happen. There needed to be that one test county that showed, what we're pushing, it is not harmful. will work, it will help people, and folks are now seeing that to be true. And so they now want it everywhere, which is why we have formed our leadership pack. We desperately want this to take hold across the state because we can see the benefits, and we know that what we are doing is certainly, furthering our work to end mass incarceration.
Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure to have you, and keep up the good fight.
Thank you for having
us. So I keep thinking about something that one of our previous guests said on a segment that she was on, which was that the role of prosecutors when it comes to reforming offices that are laced with structural inequity is hard work, but it's also work that really needs to be done. It's a lot more work than going with the status quo, but when you are in charge of people's lives, when you are somebody who is responsible for holding someone's freedom in your hand, you have to go both backwards and inwards to do that hard work. And we see that Washtenaw County is a place that can be a model for other counties when it comes to reforming the way that we view pretrial detention. And this is something that's important to do given the pushback that often comes against pretrial detention, or that comes against reforms to pretrial detention. And so we're super excited to be following this policy and to see how it expands to other cities, to other states, other counties, and we'll have to see how that turns out. So thank you so much for joining us on the Appeal Live today. I'm Alana Sivan. You can continue following us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest news. We'll see you next time.